means that the number one pick in the 2021 NBA draft goes to the Detroit Pistons.
Who's got the number one pick in this year's draft? Who's got the number one pick in this year's draft?
Basketball!
Select Isaiah Stewart.
The Detroit Pistons select Killian Hayes.
Sadiq, that was absolutely sensational.
I don't know what went into that process. I met the criteria to be selected, but I wasn't.
From long range. Oh! Yes!
Detroit basketball! Pistons fans, welcome back to another edition of the Palace of Pistons Podcast, part of the Believe Network. I'm your host, Mike Anguilano, and joining me is Aaron Johnson. Aaron, how are you doing, buddy? Fresh off watching some really weird midday basketball.
Yeah, we kind of had it with Martin Luther King Day on Monday, and then today with the Pistons playing in Paris. So had a couple days where I had the opportunity while I was home just to watch some NBA basketball. Definitely not going to complain about that, but it was a really rough performance for the Pistons overall. A few bright spots, not too many though, for what should have been, a fun trip. But it's a business trip at the end of the day. Didn't go well for the Pistons. I know we'll talk about that, but I'm doing good, and I'm excited to be here. Missing Jasper this week. Hopefully we'll get him back next week. Yeah,
we haven't been able to get the three of us together to do a podcast in quite a few weeks, so hopefully Jasper will be able to catch us on the next one. And yes, the Pistons did play in Paris. We will cover that, as well as stock report and some trade deadline speculation as the deadline continues to hurtle at us. It's already the 19th of January. This is pretty crazy, to be quite honest. And the trade chatter is only going to get louder and louder. But before we go ahead and cover all of that, I want to thank our sponsor once again this week, and that is BetOnline. And BetOnline remains your number one source for all your sports betting this season. Everything from NFL playoffs to pro and college basketball, UFC, MMA, and more. You'll always find the latest odds, team matchup info, player news, and game trends at BetOnline. And with live betting options, free contests, and live scores for almost any sport or game imaginable, BetOnline is always is truly the fastest and easiest way to bet all your favorite leagues and events. Head on over to the website today or use your mobile device to join and receive a 50% welcome bonus with your first deposit. Use that promo code BLEAV, that's BLEAV, to receive your rewards. Again, a 50% welcome bonus on your first deposit at BetOnline using the promo code BLEAV, BLEAV. BetOnline, where the game starts. And where the game starts for the NBA today was in Paris. The Bulls and the Pistons played. Some connections there to France, of course, with Killian Hayes. But unfortunately, the Pistons did lose. That game just wrapped up about, half an hour ago. They lost 126 to 108. Jalen Duren came off the bench. He returned from an injury and some passport issues to score 11 points. He brought down 12 boards and had 2 blocks in just 18 minutes. Killian Hayes has continued to struggle. In his return to France, he only had 4 points on 2 of 13 shooting. He did have 8 assists, and the Pistons now sit at 12 and 36. So kind of a tough one to watch. I was saying before the podcast started, I didn't get a chance to watch too much of it due to the 3 o'clock start time in my 9 to 5 job. But you did. What are your initial thoughts coming off of that game? I think there was a little bit more hope that Killian Hayes would start to turn things around, come back to France, could be a little bit of a little boost mentally, but it did not quite materialize.
Yeah, it was really no different. Going to a different country didn't change anything for the Pistons. It's a lot of the same problems that have plagued this team all year. And for them, it starts on the defensive end. I mean, they gave up 30 points in every quarter but the third. And in the third quarter, they gave up 28 points. So, they were right on the margin there. A team that, Chicago did not shoot the ball well from beyond the arc today. I mean, the Pistons struggled from the 3-point line, but so did the Bulls, shooting just 30%. It came off of a lot of points in the paint. The Pistons gave up 60 points in the paint. They gave up second chance points. It's just a team that is not committed on the defensive end. It's not something that's, different from what we've seen all year. for them in that regard. And it just kind of was what it was. And offensively, the Pistons, they're the Pistons. I mean, again, shot the ball poorly from beyond the arc, 23.5%, 8 of 34. And that included a couple, they had 2 3-pointers with under a minute left in garbage time from Bojan Bogdanovic and Jaden Ivey. That's really the cusp of it. They just don't play good basketball. It's been that way all year. And today was more of the same. It's just frustrating when you see them go out and play like this, and makes the Chicago team, who has been very, very underwhelming this year, look way better than they have played this season. Chicago just took it to Detroit from the get-go. All 3 of their quote-unquote big 3 guys got theirs when they wanted it, whether it was Zach LaVine, who had 30, DeMar DeRozan, or Nikola Vucevic. Patrick Williams had a solid game. Alex Caruso ate up Detroit defensively. So it was a rough performance all around. And you had some disappointing performances. Killian Hayes, 2 of 13 from the field, 4 points, 4 turnovers, 8 assists, didn't hit a single 3-point attempt. Some of the other guys, Isaiah Stewart, really looked undersized and overmatched today against Vucevic, with Duran coming off the bench and Stewart starting at the 5 slot. So it was an ugly game for Detroit, but to be honest, it's kind of what we see every game. There'll be a couple guys who have that average to above average game, but there's too many guys that don't play well, and the defense is just never there for this group.
So we talked on past podcasts about some sort of identity and the Pistons cultivating an identity. And I think that does start with Dwayne Casey. And we've talked about a lack of identity. Right now, the identity of this team is, they're young, but they're bad. We need to try to change that moving forward. I think having a defensive mindset is good for any young team. I revert back to the Cavaliers a lot because that's the team that I can primarily see all the time. The Cavs were a very good defensive team last year. They were very young, and they ate that up with a new head coach. They relished the opportunity to play defense. After being one of the league's worst defenses for several years, they relished the opportunity to be a good defensive team. Not saying the Pistons are going to be that or are capable of being that, but cultivating an identity would go a long way. Because you're right. And, in looking at the box score, these were pretty, for the most part, aside from the shooting splits, the Pistons weren't out rebounded. They were not out assisted. They won the turnover battle by a few, I think maybe 2 or 3. They just were outplayed defensively, and they were outshot on offense. They gave up 54% shooting from the floor to a Chicago team that has not had DeMar DeRozan for a little while, has had up and down games from Zach LaVine. He is starting to come around a little bit more. They've dealt with the injuries, they've dealt with ineffectiveness, but they found a way to win. It would have been nice to see the Pistons squeak one out in Paris, but you're right. It's more of the same. The offense didn't really show up. The defense doesn't really exist, or there's no identity on either side of the ball. And it's what we're going to have to deal with for the rest of the season, unfortunately, because the Pistons were also healthy. They got back Jalen Duran. They've had Isaiah Livers back for a few games now. They obviously won't get Cade Cunningham back, but there were limited excuses. It was just a very flat looking game from what I saw.
It was. It's no different. It's a team that, again, for a team that also is so bad offensively, and they don't really have an identity on the offensive end. They're not a team that shoots the ball very well. They don't, penetrate at some high level. They don't get a lot of paint points. They don't have some big down low that's cascading their offense. They don't have any identity offensively. That tells you need to try to find an identity somewhere else, aka the defensive side of the floor. And they don't have any identity on the defensive side. They get blown by. They allow a ton of penetration from the guards. And when you get beat on the glass, this is what's going to happen on a nightly basis. So, it's not something, again, that's been different at any other point this year. It's more the same, but it's still frustrating nonetheless.
So looking at the box score, Killian Hayes and Isaiah Stewart combined to shoot 3 for 23, 0 for 10 from deep. We have waxed nostalgia about Killian Hayes's solid stretch of play, but the shooting has plateaued sharply. And, we've talked about Isaiah Stewart too, as a tweener at the 4 and the 5. He started at center today in place of Duren and working his way back. We've talked about Stewart trying to cultivate. I've said cultivate like 4 or 5 times on the podcast. It's going to be my word of the podcast is cultivate. Try to carve out some sort of role, whether he plays the 4 or the 5. And, the three of us, we've talked about him developing some sort of 3-point shot or some off the dribble stuff where he doesn't get smoked or have his pocket picked. Looking at these guys, and Jaden Ivey was 7 for 14 with 16 points. I think he's been fine too in an interesting role, not playing next to Cade Cunningham, and Saddiq Bey shot 6 of 17. Tim Forkin in our group chat said that he goes from having the worst 3 minutes of basketball to the best, and there's just no in between with Saddiq Bey. Not to highlight or downplay their struggles, but those are 3 guys that we've talked about prior to this season as ones you have to make a decision on, and the play lately has been nothing short of erratic for all 3 of them.
Yeah, they're the 3 first-round picks from the 2020 draft class. Troy Weaver's first draft, his first, few months with the organization. That was his initial imprint on this franchise. That was part of how he decided to retool and rebuild this team by tearing it down and acquiring 3 draft picks, acquiring 2 draft picks to start to lay the foundation for this group. And now here we are in year 3 for these players, in year 3 for Troy Weaver. And all 3 of those guys, who gets a second contract on this team out of those 3 guys? Jalen Duren's usurped Isaiah Stewart as the big of the future for this team, the starting 5 of the future, whether you believed or didn't believe Stewart was going to be that moving forward.
He has usurped him as the starting 5 of the now.
That as well. It hasn't happened yet, but it should be the case where Duren, I know he came off the bench today. Maybe that was just a minutes restriction thing. I guess that's what I'll hope. But Duren is the guy now. Saddiq Bey, again, you just don't know what you're going to get on a nightly basis. He's been a little bit better as of late, but still the efficiency isn't anything where you're, all excited about this. He might be getting 15, 16, 17 points, but the efficiency is so sporadic on a nightly basis. And then Killian Hayes, who did look like it was all coming together for him, has had, for as many good performances that he's had this month, he's had equally as many performances where he's been non-existent. I mean, this isn't the first game of the month where he's 2 of double digits from the field. He was 3 of 12 against the Warriors, 2 of 11 in the second game against the Sixers, and 2 of 13 tonight. And he was 4 of 14 against the Knicks. So he's just not, he's not consistent enough. So you look at all these guys, and these guys that, again, decisions have to be made, and I don't think there's any clarity on, I know this is a guy that I want to have on this group moving forward. I know that one of these 3 first-round picks is going to be one of my starters moving forward. I don't think you can say that confidently about any of those players, and that's disappointing.
We talked about the beginning of the season. Again, these are the guys that need to be evaluated, and even if Cade Cunningham's out, which we talked a little bit after he was out about, what can we possibly look for the rest of a Glum. I think I mixed up those 2 words.
That's all right.
A pretty poor season overall. The thing that we told everybody to watch for was those 3 players, because it's a critical time, and to not see one of them really jump out is pretty disappointing. You know, if you had to give a contract to one of those three guys, which one are you going to give it to?
Oh gosh, that's tough. I think it would be Isaiah Stewart. I think he's a fine backup big. You know, a guy where if you needed to start him at the 5, you know, if Duran's missing a game or two, hopefully it's in matchups where it's not against someone like that can punish him down low, like a Vucevic, like a Joel Embiid. But again, that's going to be the case sometimes. But as a backup big, as a guy that can play is trying to play the full 4, is trying to expand his game, the defensive prowess that he can play with, I think he's the guy that I would trust the most as being some sort of contributor moving forward. Not that Hayes can't be that, not that Saddiq Bey can't be a solid piece off the bench, just in terms of being a guy that can be a scoring threat. But the inconsistency from both those players is most concerning, especially when you talk about these contract extensions where I'm sure Saddiq Bey, Killian Hayes, and Isaiah Stewart all alike are going to want to be making double-digit $1 million on average each season. So for me, I think Stewart's a guy that, in terms of what he brings on a nightly basis, he's a good rebounder, even for being a bit undersized and being a backup big. You know, it'll be easier for him to play against second unit bigs, second unit 4s. That's the guy that I'd probably feel most comfortable. But even so, I mean, it's still not a decision where I'm like super excited about the thoughts of Isaiah Stewart getting $10-12 million annually. But at the same time, this is the same front office that gave Marvin Bagley $12 million a year. So who knows?
It's going to be very interesting to see how this plays out between those guys, because you're going to have a lot of cap space. You're going to have some decisions to make. You're probably going to get some interest at the deadline. We've already seen some stories of Saddiq Bey being linked to trade rumors and teams being interested in him. So it'll be very interesting. I think it'd be maybe a good question to ask all of our listeners of like, this is a pivotal point for the Pistons moving forward. This is where decisions have to be made. The last couple of years have been like, yeah, well, you know, we'll just grab players that we think fit or best player available, and we'll just go from there. We'll see what sticks. It's now decision-making time. So, you know, for all of our listeners, who would you give another contract to between Saddiq Bey, Isaiah Stewart, and Killian Hayes? I think it's an interesting question.
Yeah, I'd definitely be interested to hear what the listeners have to say. I'm sure there's going to be...
I was pretty surprised with you saying Stewart. I thought you would have said Saddiq Bey, honestly.
I think there's cases, again, I think there's cases for each player individually, but if you sign all three, you're probably looking at around $30 million annually. And do you want to commit that? Do you want to commit more than that with the cap going up? But knowing that you're drafting another top 5 pick this year, you have Cade Cunningham, you have Jaden Ivey, you have Jalen Duren, you have Bogdanovic on an extension, and you want to be players in the market, whether that's in the trade market this offseason or in the free agency market, to go out and get a guy that you feel is going to help you take that next step. Do you want to then go and commit that money to all three of these guys who, to be fair, to be honest, have underwhelmed all on an individual level in their careers so far? But I think it's an interesting question, and I know we will get answers for each of these players.
Yes, we definitely will. And we've talked a lot about Killian Hayes over the last several months, but I think all this talk about Saddiq Bey and all this talk about Killian Hayes is a good segue into our stock report for the week. So, Aaron, give us your stock up guy.
So I am going to go with Saddiq Bey. There's not a whole lot of players that you can go with. I would use Jalen Duren again. Sorry. I don't know why my computer decides to play music when I go on ESPN.com. But I was trying to look at Saddiq Bey's game log. But in short, I guess, since I can't look at all his stats, he's been better over the last 5 games now. He was off to a little bit of a rough patch, but again, he's been better. The efficiency still isn't there. He's still hovering around 42% from the floor, 35% from the 3-point line. That's not great, but I feel like he is taking better shots. I feel like with Saddiq Bey, he sometimes just gets in that mode where like, okay, I'm going up with this one. and it's not always a great look, whether it's, he steps into a contested mid-range jumper, he barrels into a defender trying to drive to the lane. The shot process is better for him. He's rebounding a little bit more. I feel like he's getting involved more in that area of the game. And, he's gotten 15, 16, 17 points a game over these last 5, having to play a little bit of a bigger role with some different guys out, playing in the starting lineup again. I feel like it's been better. It's certainly not been great by any stretch of the imagination, but like these are the games, these are the minutes where it's like, okay, I can envision him, if he can put more stuff together, coming off the bench and playing this similar type of role. The efficiency, again, has to get better, but I feel like Bey is trending in the right direction. Again, not perfect, but it's getting there for him. Whereas, a couple of weeks ago, it was just like, oh man, I mean, really this whole season, it's been, I don't know what the future looks like for him. This looks really rough. And obviously that's been felt by the organization a little bit with him popping up in trade rumors, about a month or so ago, and teams checking in on his availability now that Detroit might be softening on how much he might be worth to them long term.
Yeah. So his last 10 games, he's shooting 39% from the floor, 36% from deep, still an excellent free throw shooter, and averaging 15 points per game. I mean, it's hovering right around where he has been. He did have a nice stretch from the Minnesota game to the next game where he had 20 points or more in 3 straight. So, yeah, the vision is still there. Like when you see him play well, you think, oh, that's the mold of the player that almost every team in the NBA needs, is a wing that's capable of knocking down shots and can use their body to defend. I agree he is playing better, but I'm going to go with a different wing for my stock up, and that's Hamidou Diallo, who has been playing exceptionally well of late. I think there was a snafu with the scoreboard, or at least the stats, like you said, but he finished the Paris game shooting 7 of 8 from deep. He had 17 points. He's sort of had to pick up minutes and time, as guys have been injured, but he did have 19 points against the New Orleans Pelicans, shot very well in that game. He shot exceptionally well again against the Wolves with 18 more points. So he's a microwave kind of guy, where he's hot or he's cold or he's completely invisible or what, but he's been playing a little bit better of late. This is the kind of action that we were hoping for when the Pistons re-signed him, or at least kept him on the roster. So Hamidou Diallo is my stock up. I wish we didn't have to play him as much. I wish we would be able to have a healthy squad, but he has come in and he's shot the ball well, and he hasn't killed the offense like a player like him is normally capable of. A guy who can't really shoot, that has to use physical strength and athleticism to make an impact. He's been playing well as of late. So Hamidou Diallo is my stock up. Now, what about your stock down?
I like your stock up, by the way. I think Diallo has been pretty effective for Detroit. He can have these stretches where he's getting to the rim. He brings that energy that not everyone else on the team plays with, and that allows him to make an impact. And I think also when the Pistons use him as, a 4, and even a little bit of a 5, like they did in the Minnesota game, he's just allowed to be a little bit more effective because he's playing into different areas on the court. So I like that stock up pick for you. My stock down, here come the tomatoes, here come the, everyone crying, getting mad, but it's Killian Hayes. We just kind of talked about it in the last segment, but 2 of 13 today, 4 of 14 against the Knicks. The inconsistency is just, it's baffling, because you want to believe he's putting it together. Things are trending in the right direction, but then he has these performances where it's just like, you don't know if it's ever really going to get there. And people say, oh, well, he had 8 assists, he had 9 assists. And it's like, yeah, that's good. But like Jasper said on last week's podcast, like if Killian does, get to this point where he's averaging 17 points, 6-7 assists a game, like what does that make him in the league? Does that make him a top 15 point guard? I don't think so. Does that make him a top 20 point guard? I don't think so. There's a lot of good guards in this league. And for a guy that was the 7th overall pick in a draft, like, you had very high expectations for him, as I did. So the consistency is a concern. His percentages, his averages on the month, still trending in the right direction, but the Pistons haven't played a lot of games lately. Today was their first game since Sunday. So looking at it since last week's podcast, he's been disappointing. I think it's fair to say that.
Yes, it's definitely fair to say, and you probably will get some hate based on what the Palace of Pistons Twitter account's been spitting. For those who are aware of that it's been very funny. The reaction to some of the tweets on the Palace of Pistons account have been definitely flying over people's heads, but that's for maybe Palace of Pistons After Dark can get into that more. I think somebody in the group chat asked for a emergency pod after some of the responses and the people who got involved with that, but that's for a different discussion with our good buddy Tim Forkin. I had Killian Hayes my stock down as well. The consistency is definitely not there. Yes, the assists are great. That sort of play has a place in the NBA. I don't think that we should be settling for that as the new baseline for Killian Hayes of having a good game is having a lot of assists. We can and should expect more out of the 7th overall pick. Yes, it's great. He had 8 dimes. He had 2 steals. Wonderful. He shot 2 for 13 and was 0 for 6 from deep. He's been disappointing lately. He's been erratic, to say the least. So he was also my stock down. And, I'm sure it would not surprise me anyway if in 4 weeks he's in our stock up category again because he goes on another hot shooting streak or something along those lines. Same thing with Saddiq Bey. I mean, he could very well be in your stock down within a week and a half because he's not shooting the ball well anymore. And that kind of makes him, if he's not doing that, then he's pretty one-dimensional. So we're both on the same page with Killian Hayes. And speaking of Saddiq Bey and some of those trade rumors that we've talked about, we're going to get into our second topic for today. It's also our last topic, but it's the trade deadline speculation, which I think is going to be a standing order for the rest of the podcasts until we get past the trade deadline. Lots of guys have been in talks across the league now. Once again, we get another story about Bojan Bogdanovic. The Pistons are looking for an unprotected first-round pick. There have been several teams interested in him. We've talked about a couple of them over the last couple of months. Pistons aren't opposed to moving him, according to James Edwards of The Athletic, but it certainly looks like it's gonna take quite the asset for Detroit to move Bojan Bogdanovic. Do you want me to just run through all these and then we'll talk about them sort of as a conglomerate, or do you want me to go through each of these players on their own?
I feel
we'll just talk about them individually.
Well, I feel like we should talk about Bogdanovic individually, just because it seems like things are starting to flip in a different direction. After the Pistons acquired him, after the Pistons extended him, it sounded like, Bogdanovic is here to stay. They acquired him for a reason. They want to be in a position to compete for a playoff position next year. He's not getting dealt unless the team severely overpays to get him. And now here we are. Time's gone on. We're, less than a month away from the trade deadline. And it sounds like the position from Detroit's point of view is softening. Now, instead of it's going to take multiple first-round picks, or it's going to take a first-round pick and young assets, young players to acquire them, now it's the Pistons are looking at the very least, which means at, what they're going to end up getting for an unprotected first-round pick. So it feels like what Detroit's looking for, the Pistons were playing hard to get in the market. Teams are not budging on that. And now it feels like the stance is starting to soften from Troy Weaver's office. And to me, that signals it's getting more and more likely that Bogdanovic is going to be moved. Again, I'm in the camp of, unless a team is willing to overpay and you're getting multiple firsts for them, fine. You can, if you really believe those picks are going to move the needle for you, you can make that deal. But I'm of the camp, you should not be trading Bogdanovic if you want to be competing next year, which the organization should and needs to be doing next season. This is disappointing to me in that sense, but that's what how I'm reading the tea leaves right now. It sounds like a Bogdanovic deal is becoming more likely than it was maybe 3 weeks ago.
So Shams Shrani of The Athletic reported, I think this was a couple days ago, maybe a day ago, that once again, the Cavs and Mavericks are among the teams interested. The Raptors, the Lakers, the Pelicans, and the Milwaukee Bucks were also listed amongst the teams interested in Bogdanovic. I can tell you, unprotected first-round pick, you can knock the Cavs right out of that conversation. They're not going to be playing in the Bogdanovic playing field. It's going to be one of those other teams. I think the Pelicans are pretty interesting. You know, they have not had Brandon Ingram for quite a while, and they're still playing well. They've missed Zion, and yet they're still playing well. The Bucks would be really interesting. They already have Joe Ingles. Joe Ingles and Bojan Bogdanovic, I feel like, are very similar players in that NBA Twitter loves them because they are not big high-flying names, but they lead to winning. So I think having both of them, if this was like 2016, I think NBA Twitter would have exploded if the Bucks somehow had both Ingles and Bogdanovic. But those are the teams right now interested. I mean, really, everybody should be interested in a wing who can knock down threes at a pretty good clip. Out of those teams, you know, who makes sense from making a deal sort of scenario, because the Raptors are they're a really weird team. They have so many wings and they are just inconsistent. They're kind of middling. I mean, they come out and they smoke, you know, the Knicks or whatever. Well, the Cavs. They beat the Cavs twice. And then they go out and lay an egg and they lose to Orlando. So the Raptors just seem like a super weird team. We don't know what the Lakers are going to do. Jeannie Buss is reportedly super not willing to move future first-round picks. The Bucks, I don't even know if they need Bogdanovic. They don't have a healthy Chris Middleton, and they're still plowing through people. And the Mavs are super, super interesting. They just had a report from ESPN that said Luka Doncic is ready to have some heads roll if the team doesn't improve. I don't know if giving up an unprotected first for Bogdanovic is going to do enough. I think Luka needs a true sidekick, but, you know, which of these teams tickles your fancy, I guess, in terms of being able to make a trade?
Yeah, I think Dallas is the team that most desperately needs him because Luka desperately needs help. And Bogdanovic would certainly be, you know, the best offensive piece alongside Luka on that team outside of Christian Wood. You know, they just don't have a consistent group of wings that are
getting now hurt, by the way.
Minutes. Wood is hurt? I didn't even know that.
Christian Wood, I believe.
I know he missed like a game or two. I didn't know it was going to be a longer term absence, but obviously that's not good. And that puts even more pressure on Luka and more pressure on the Mavs to make a move happen. I don't think Dallas really has the assets to make this move. So I don't know how that works. I don't know if they would need to get a third team involved in this type of trade. I look at a team like Toronto, and I don't really view them as buyers. I view them, you know, if they do make decisions, I think it would kind of have to be to sort of start selling off some of those guys, whether it's Fred VanVleet, Gary Trent, if they do end up moving OG Anunoby. I know they've been linked to Jakob Poeltl, but again, I just don't. They've won a few games here, and maybe that's what they needed to kind of say, all right, let's go in now. We're figuring it out. Let's go get a center because that's what we really desperately need. But with all the wings they have, I don't think a guy like Bogdanovic really makes sense there. Milwaukee, I think, would love Bogdanovic, but I don't think they have the assets to really acquire him or the cap space. And then the Lakers are the team that is attached to Bogdanovic in every single report, but I just don't know what they have, especially if they're willing to give up those first-round picks that gets this deal through, because there's no world where guys like Kendrick Nunn are viewed as positive young assets that are worth moving on from, you know, a 20-point per game scorer that Bogdanovic is. So I don't know I don't have the best idea where Bogdanovic lands. I think New Orleans could be an interesting spot. But again, I just don't know if they really need him. If guys like Ingram and Zion are healthy, that's the 3-4. Najee Marshall's been really good for them. Trey Murphy's been really good for them. So they have the depth. They just need their top-end guys to be healthy. So I don't know who the right spot is for Bojan, but it does feel like with seemingly, I think the report was, double-digit teams or over a dozen teams are interested in Bogdanovic. If the price is only a first, it feels like that's going to come from somewhere.
Yeah, and to follow up on the Christian Wood situation, the Mavs announced today he does have a fractured thumb and he'll be evaluated in 1 week. So he is hurt, but that was a pretty recent development. So that's one less quality player for Luka Doncic. And yeah, the Mavs are definitely the most desperate team. And I've said this on the podcast before, this Dallas Mavericks team feels very much like 2007, 2008 Cavaliers, where it was LeBron and Eric Snow and, Sasha Pavlovich, guys that independently are not very good players, but because LeBron was on the team, they were like stars. I mean, I think Mo Williams might be the only player on that team that was able to hold his own in any instance, but this feels very much like first run LeBron on the Cavs, where it's Nerlens Noel Nerlens Noel, where it's Luka Doncic. And I was reading Nerlens as our next player, and it just totally messed me up, where it's Luka Doncic and just stuff. And you just hope that stuff plays well enough to squeak out enough wins to make like a Western Conference Finals. But Bogdanovic starting to have the trade market soften a bit. We'll have to keep tabs on that. But I'm in the same boat as you. I really don't want them to trade him unless they get a nice package back for him. They did just pay him. He's a very quality player for probably the most needed position in all basketball. Let's go ahead and move on. Alec Burks has been named as a possible trade target as well. I think that was sort of thought of as soon as the Pistons acquired him as a guy who would be traded at some point just because he's a vet who could shoot. Once again, James Edwards of The Athletic says that the Pistons have shown very little interest in trading Alec Burks. He is a quality bench piece on a young team. I think you need guys like that. And James Edwards adds that he senses the team would have to really overpay to try to pry away Alec Burks from the Pistons. Any thoughts on Alec Burks' trade market or the propensity that the Pistons just really don't want to trade him?
It's another guy that I don't think the Detroit should actively really be looking to move on a fine contract. You have him next season. If a team wants to give up a first, then it becomes a discussion. I doubt a team's willing to give up a first. Alec Burks isn't a starting guard in the league. He's a backup. He's a veteran. And he's really just a scorer. It's not like he's some incredible defender or secondary ball handler or secondary distributor, So, he is good for Detroit because of what he brings to the table. It's something that Detroit needs. And I know other teams are certainly interested in him, but I don't think a team's going to look at their situation and say, Alec Burks is going to make or break our season to a point where I need to move a first-round pick for him.
Yeah, there's no way that is going to happen. I don't think. I mean, unless it's super heavily protected. And I'm in the same boat. I don't think that they should really be trying to move him. Again, you need guys to score the basketball, and on an injury-ravaged team that's super young, it's not the worst thing in the world to have a vet on the bench to soak up some minutes and score some points. So I don't agree with trading Burks either, unless, of course, you're absolutely blown away by some sort of offer that is stupid to turn down. We've talked about Saddiq Bey several times. The Pistons are looking for a first-round pick in return. James Edwards of The Athletic gets the impression that Detroit's not willing to move on from him just yet, but he will be a restricted free agent, not this upcoming summer, but the following summer. But of course, he will be extension eligible. So if you get a first-round pick, like let's say that you get a first-round pick that's in the 17 to 25 range. Let's just say it's 20 to 25 range. Is that enough to move the needle to trade Saddiq Bey?
I don't know. I mean, I don't know enough about this draft class to really make that kind of decision. Not that deep into the draft class, at least. You'd like to believe Saddiq Bey is worth more than that. I mean, you gave up assets to pick him at 19. So it's tough, but then you also have to weigh the fact that that's one of those three guys that we already talked about, that you're going to have to make a decision on whether or not you want to pay him in the upcoming offseason. So it's a tough decision for Detroit. I think if you get a first and Saddiq Bey is one of those guys that maybe you don't feel is really necessary to keep. Maybe you feel like, especially if you do keep Bogdanovic and you have Isaiah Livers and you're going to keep Alec Burks, maybe you feel like another first round pick, you sign another backup wing in the offseason and you'll be fine there. I don't know. That's kind of how I would think Detroit would kind of play it out. If they want to keep him, I don't think the first round pick is going to really move the needle for them if it's the 25th pick in the draft. If they view him to a point where they want to extend him, they want to give him a 3-4 year deal, I doubt that pick 25 is going to be what they'd be willing to not extend him for.
So there is another option, and that's just they don't sign him to an extension and they don't trade him. We've seen teams do this. We saw the Suns and DeAndre Ayton, just quote unquote not come to an agreement on a deal. We saw the Cavs and Colin Sexton just not come to terms on a deal, and they ended up getting traded. Or in the case of DeAndre Ayton, they were signed. They don't have to do either of those things. They don't have to trade him. They don't have to sign him this offseason. He is a restricted free agent next offseason, so that's when things could get a little bit more interesting. And, we've talked about it. He's been very inconsistent. Maybe there's a situation where, the Pistons want to see that growth next year when you're going to have a top 5 pick. You're going to have, potentially 1, 2, 3 new free agency signings on the roster, and you're going to have some heightened expectations. You might even have a different coach. We haven't even talked about that as a possibility next year, but it's possible. And that's the situation where you can assess Saddiq Bey one more time. This is an assessment season for him and for Isaiah Stewart and for Killian Hayes, but they don't have to. If they're really on the fence, I don't want to accept like 2 seconds in a player for Saddiq Bey necessarily. I mean, unless he just hits rock bottom between now and February and there's really nothing more that you could do, but they don't have to move on from him and they don't have to sign him. I mean, there is another situation where he plays out next season through contract talks, quote unquote. And, they see what it looks like next year too.
That's true. They can do that. It's just that risk of he might punt his value or he might significantly raise his value. And I guess if that's the case, if he raises his value, it's a lot easier to then say, all right, well, we believed in you and, we're going to extend you because you're a restricted free agent and we want you to be a part of this. But there's also that chance of things continue to trend in a negative direction. And that value that he has, whereas maybe he is right now worth a first round pick, that could go away. And then you're out a player and you're out a potential asset in return.
Yeah, it's a tight rope to walk. But the trade talk will continue to heat up, especially as we get closer and closer to the deadline. Last part on the list is Nerlens Noel. The Pistons and Noel have agreed to look for a trade. If it doesn't happen, Detroit's not going to pick up his team option. Probably help to facilitate a trade. He's a vet. He's been in the league for a while. Teams do this. It creates goodwill with agents as well. Agents might be more willing to send their client to a team or help facilitate a move to a team in the offseason to a team that, cares about its players. And if they help Noel facilitate a trade or buy him out or do something like that, I think that does create some goodwill for an agent. I think that they can probably get something for him, though. The Heat, the Nuggets, and the Mavericks have reportedly shown interest in acquiring Nerlens Noel. We've talked about him several times. He's a backup big. He There was just a recent story about him where he stepped into the role of the starting center or taking up some significant minutes in the wake of Jalen Duren's injury. He didn't blink. He just went to work. I think that has a lot of value. Nerlens Noel is a guy, again, we thought it around the time when he was required that we didn't really think he'd be on the roster past the trading deadline, and I still don't really think that that's going to happen, but any additional thoughts on Nerlens Noel?
Yeah, I mean, it feels like he's going to get moved. He wants to get moved. The Pistons agreed to look to move him. There's some teams interested. I don't see a point in Detroit keeping him. They haven't really played him outside of a handful of games from last week. But other than that, even the last few games that they didn't have Duren, he didn't get in. So they don't really seem to really care about playing him, which is fine, especially if they are trying to move him. And maybe if they don't move him, they find him a few minutes here and there, especially if a guy like Stewart or Duren has to miss a game here or there. But it just feels like it makes sense to move him. Both sides have agreed looking for a trade is the right idea. It just comes to the point of, what is Detroit getting back? Are they clearing out salary? Are they getting any sort of asset back from him? Does the team believe that, he's worth giving up a second round pick for or whatever? And that's really it. There's not really much going on in that situation that matters. No deal is going to make or break anything for this franchise currently.
Yeah. And he was a DNP, coach's decision, against the Bulls today. Did not play against the Knicks. He did play 4 straight games with Jalen Duren's injury, but prior to that, he had 6 minutes in 4 games combined, dating back to the 31st of December. So he's not a guy that's going to move the needle in any trade. But like I said earlier, with, helping to facilitate a trade for a vet, I think agents look at that as a positive for a team that's willing to do that. I think gets in the good graces of the agents that are helping to move players around the league. So maybe you get a second round pick, maybe you get a player and a second round pick, or you take on some bad money in return. I think he's going to be off the roster come the deadline. If he's not, I think they will look to try to secure a buyout in some way, just to do some good by him. And that's it for our trade deadline speculation. This is, once again, I think it's going to be a standing item for all of these podcasts for the next month. But it's going to continue to heat up. A little off the wall question before we end this podcast. Who's going to be the biggest name traded at the deadline?
Good question. I think this is really something that's been charged by the play-in tournament, is more and more teams feel that they have enough or a piece away from being a playoff team. So not as many teams are willing to sell off their players. I think anyone on Toronto, if Toronto does decide to move on from some guys, whether that's Fred VanVleet, whether that's OG Anunoby, heck, even if it's Pascal Siakam, even though I doubt they would trade him.
Wow.
Well, I think it'd be any of those guys. If Toronto opened up the roster, if Toronto opened up for business, I think those would be the 3 biggest names on the market. I think Bogdanovic is a rather significant name. Other than that, we haven't heard a ton on guys being available. Who's the last superstar that's been brought up in trade discussions? Nothing around Damian Lillard, nothing around Bradley Beal. So there's nothing really going on right now. No team feels like they're in a deep enough hole right now where they have to start moving on and starting a rebuild, unless Toronto is that group that makes that decision. That's the team that I think holds all the cards for the upcoming trade deadline. And on the flip side for them, with so many teams feeling that they're maybe a piece away from being a playoff team, a piece away from being a contender. If you're a team like the Los Angeles Lakers, you're a team like the Los Angeles Clippers, oh my goodness, you would give up whatever was necessary in terms of young players or assets, draft picks, to get a guy like Fred VanVleet. So they hold a lot in the cards this deadline, especially if they do decide to tear it down. They could really bring in some big assets for guys like VanVleet or OG Anunoby.
That's a really good pick. I was initially going to say John Collins, just because he's been in trade talks forever. And it seems like some teams, the Utah Jazz apparently are interested in acquiring him. But I think that, the Raptors guys would make waves if Toronto was willing to just tear it down, build around Siakam and Scotty Barnes. That would be very interesting. Teams would give up a lot for OG Anunoby. In the same way that we say that Saddiq Bey is valuable as a wing, multiply that by like 80, and then you have OG Anunoby's value as a lockdown, lanky defender who can, contribute on offense. Okay. Thought that was just a nice little question at the end of the podcast. Since trade talk is about to dominate my Twitter feed for the next 2 months, may as well start to get it into the podcast as well, outside of the Pistons, who very well could just not trade anybody and have a super quiet deadline and everybody gets annoyed. I think that is something that isn't talked about enough as a distinct possibility. They just don't do anything because they don't have to.
Yeah, there's this deadline could be super, super quiet. This deadline could be super crazy if Toronto opens up the books, if John Collins gets moved, if Bojan Bogdanovic gets moved. It really just depends on where teams decide they want to change, go in terms of direction. And Toronto easily holds the cards in that regard.
Yep, they sure do. And we'll be keeping track of all of it. And we hope that you will be keeping up with us as we follow all of the trade deadline speculation as things really start to heat up here in the doldrums of January and February, heading into the All-Star break before we even know it. Aaron, any last thoughts before we close this episode of the podcast?
No, the Pistons aren't back in action until Monday, so they have a little bit of an extended rest period. Obviously got to travel back from France. It's going to take probably a day or two to readjust to obviously the time zone change and all of that stuff. So they are back in action Monday. I believe it's against Milwaukee, so certainly not an easy game to come back to the States for. But they got some time off in between them, so hopefully they can rest up. Jalen Duren is healthy, and I know Killian Hayes took a fall at the end of the game. He was kind of laboring his shoulder, so hopefully he's good to go as well. You definitely don't want injuries to these young guys that are really the only thing worth watching with the Pistons right now is how these young guys continue to play, whether they're improving, whether they're regressing. Those types of things are what we're watching for at this point in the year when the team is 12-36. So that's really it.
Yeah, I'm going to count that as a positive. Watching the young guys, even if it's up against the Bucks, it'll still be entertaining. And we are going to be tuning in, and we hope that you'll be tuning in to us as well. We're going to continue covering the Pistons through the thick and thin, even if that is losses over in Europe, which thankfully they won't have to be subject to that anymore. So that's going to do it for this edition of the Palace of Pistons podcast, part of the Believe Network. For my co-host, Aaron Johnson, I am Mike Anguilano. Thank you so much for joining us once again on this week's episode, and we will see you all next time.